for the intro. Steve, I think hopefully you'll kind of stay on top of admitting people in the lobby and so on as they join in.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Great. So I want to kind of maybe start by giving just a quick introduction to myself, and then we can kind of proceed on the rest of the presentation. Although it's really less of a presentation, more of a discussion. Please do feel free to interrupt with questions, either on the phone or the chat window, and I'll try and kind of get to them. So let me start with the intros, as I said. My name is Anand. I've been in the Azure team about 3 years now. Been at Microsoft for several years, a little bit. I think it's about 12, 13, something like that. I've also had some startup experience as well. I was co-founder at a web services startup. This was several years ago now, back in around 2000, and then I ran engineering at another knowledge management startup. Think about it as kind of like a Quora type startup, but more focused on on-prem and focused specifically on enterprises, rather than the overall internet. This was also several years ago, and so I have some experience, kind of in that space, and kind of what life in startups looks like. Specifically, with Azure, my focus has been primarily on the Linux side and on the open source side. Since when I was running my startup, that was also happened to be a lot of the technology choices that we made, were based on those kind of stacks. And so now my job is to basically make sure that those stacks run great on Azure, and that's more or less what the objective of this entire next hour is going to be about. One small clarification and or correction is that I think we kind of mostly just talk about Azure. I think the product at one point used to be called Windows Azure, but we don't typically kind of talk about that as much anymore, because of the fact that Linux is actually a very, very significant part of it, and we'll get into that in a lot more detail. So let me start by presenting a couple of slides, and then we can kind of get from there. Wonderful. So let me start off. As I said, we tend to talk about Azure. There's actually a huge amount of momentum that has been building in terms of running Linux on Azure, and OSS on Azure as well. Just kind of a few proof points of that. Recently, we obviously have telemetry that through which we're able to go in there and look at what kind of VMs people are going and creating. At this point, more than 30% of all the VMs running on Azure are Linux. In terms of new VMs that are being created kind of on a day-to-day basis, it's actually greater than 50% at this point. In terms of third-party based solutions that people offer on Azure, and this refers to Iaas, which is infrastructure as a service. That's all based on Linux as well. We have a huge amount of contributions that we make available on GitHub, and more than 55% of those contributions are actually also based on Linux as well. So this is just basically kind of showing you some stats about the fact that there's all the words I'm saying right now. There's a lot more kind of meat behind those words. There's kind of real action and real momentum here as well. I think just to give you an example of the kind of GitHub templates that people have gone and created, there's stuff with Ansible, there's Apache, Kafka, Jenkins, Postgres, Spark, you name it. There's just a lot of stuff in there, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few more details, kind of further on down. So maybe let me start by talking a little bit about Azure itself. We think of Azure as being a hyperscale cloud. The blue areas are basically talking about all of the Azure regions that exist out there. There's a very large number of them. And then, so there's like 30 regions around the world. This is actually at this point, greater than AWS and Google combined. I think the greens are, at least when the slide was built, these were some of the newer regions. And many of these are actually also operational at this point as well. So we're continuing to go build different regions. Fundamentally, our strategy is actually very simple. We want to go and build the cloud and meet customers where they are. And so if that means that we need to go build, different regions depending on where the customers are, well, then we'll go and build them. As far as startups, the thing that this means to you is you can benefit from this in that it really allows you to go in there and target your services in the region that is nearest to where your customers are. So if your customers are US-based, well, that's fine. We have a number of US-based regions. But if your customers are more worldwide, well, we have a lot of different options there as well in terms of helping you run your service in a region that's close to your customers that allows you to provide better SLAs to them. And as I was describing, our strategy is, with Azure, it's actually very simple. We just want to run the world's workloads. And it's as simple as that. And if you kind of stop and think about what that means, we're not really being super religious about this. There are workloads that people have. We want to go and run them, and we want to go and meet them where customers are. So this means, it means, running them on the kind of devices that they use, the OS that they want, the programming languages that they pick, the kind of deployments that they want, whether it be, all in the cloud, whether it be hybrid, or whether it be, kind of more on-prem. We want to kind of just ultimately go and meet them where they are. And, and we want to be the best cloud platform to allow partners, and customers to go and succeed. So that's basically kind of what our strategy is all about. And, this is, kind of a bit of an eye chart, but, fundamentally, this is really kind of reflecting, talking a little bit about the openness point and talking about really the sheer diversity and depth of workloads that are possible to go and run on Azure today. So, starting at the infrastructure level, this is really kind of down at the OS vendor and distributions that are out there. Then kind of moving on up, there's a huge amount of databases that are out there. Then there's all the app frameworks and tools. Then there are the specific apps that kind of build on those frameworks. And then lastly, there's all the management frameworks that help you manage all these workloads as well. And then there's all the DevOps tools and clients and whatnot. So all of these things are important to Azure. We actually engage with many of these communities directly, in open source. We also engage directly sometimes with some of the vendors who are influential in those communities, and basically make sure that we tune and optimize those workloads to run well on Azure. And we can get into, I think, when I get to the demo part of it, we'll walk through some of the examples here. But this just kind of gives you just a quick idea of the sheer breadth that actually exists on Azure today. And many people sometimes are not aware of this, but I kind of wanted to bring this up here. So, another thing that I mentioned, I touched upon briefly before, is what we find is portability and consistency, between clouds, and on-prem is also really important. And so we actually do a lot of investment in that because this goes right to meeting customers where they are. So there are some customers who really want to go and build in a cross-cloud way, and we want to be friendly to that and receptive to that. There are other customers who are in some sort of a hybrid where some workloads they want to go and build still for on-prem, whether it be security or performance or compliance or some other requirement like that, while some other types of workloads maybe maybe it might be dev test, maybe it might be HA, maybe it might be DR. Those kind of scenarios is where they want to go run down the cloud. And we want to build all of our experiences and operational tools and deployment tools and frameworks and so on, kind of to be cognizant and aware of that so that we can enable those kind of scenarios. And so, in that context, there is, we do have an offering, that we do obviously have the cloud offering, which is Azure. We also have this offering called Azure Stack, which allows customers to run exactly the same set of workloads that they could run on Azure, but on infrastructure that they own and deploy themselves and manage in their own private data centers. And we see a lot of enterprises who are starting to go in there and go and do this as well, exactly for those purposes of whether it be certain compliance scenarios or certain regulatory scenarios and things of that nature. It's kind of in terms of all of the ecosystem out there, we have a huge amount of contributions and projects that we make available on GitHub. It's a growing community. There's just a few stats in terms of all the different kinds of projects that are out there and kind of what's happening. I do encourage you to also go and pay a visit and go and see what's out there. This is kind of just some backdrop that I like to kind of think about, as we talk to certain customers, kind of how the roadmap that they start to go use the cloud. And so this might be, useful for you as well, in that, I'm sure there's probably a different set of places today in terms of, where you're running things and whatnot. Obviously the intent of this is not to tell you, oh, go replace everything you have and you can run on Azure because it's great. Well, here's kind of a typical roadmap that we see typical customers kind of going through, where they might start through with using public, just for dev test. There might be some lift and shift, especially of legacy applications, for certain kinds of customers, and there might be some sort of hybrid case, maybe as I mentioned about DR and things of that nature. And then of course, then you get into the full, born in the cloud. You're building microservices, you're building apps entirely optimized and tuned just for the cloud itself. And for each of you guys, you might be at varying points in this, and some of this may be applicable to you, some of this may not be, but we do see this as a typical pattern and trend. The one thing I want to kind of talk about here is that so as far as Azure is concerned, we have this concept called Azure Resource Manager, and this is basically the fundamental concept that really everything in Azure is based off. So we model all Azure concepts as resources, and so then you can go in there and create these resources using a service, like it's kind of a real fundamental service called Azure Resource Manager. And you can of course group related resources into resource groups, and you get to decide fundamentally what you want to group together, and ARM, that's kind of what we call it here today. So that's what Azure Resource Manager stands for. Helps you kind of go and manage all of that. So in the example over here, let's say that you have a deployment consisting of a web workload, plus maybe a database, plus maybe a VM, along with the storage itself, kind of all, you could decide all of that's related, so I'm going to go put that all into one resource group. Or you might decide, no, maybe all the VMs are kind of related, so I'll just put the VMs together. I'll put the web and the database, workloads, those are related, so I'm going to go put them together. And then all the storage stuff is all different, so I'm going to kind of put that together, and then I'll kind of manage it separately. So ARM lets you do all of that. The other thing that ARM lets you do is to do role-based access control. So you might, even in your startup, you might have, some people who are, let's say, the super admins who have access to everything, but then you might have other people who just want to, where you want to give them access really to only the specific set of resources that you want them to kind of go and manage and so on. And so ARM lets you do all of the RBAC functionality as well to all these various things. So it really, as I said, is the conduit, into using really anything inside Azure. As I said, any questions, feel free to interrupt as well. Here's a quick spectrum to talk a little bit about the different choices that you have as far as, when you go and pick services that you want to go and use, and the different kinds of resources that you want to go and use. Here are a few different choices. So you can be more system administrator focused, or you can be more developer focused. And so that's kind of one spectrum. The other spectrum is you can be more saying, I want to kind of manage the infrastructure myself, or you can be more in the, hey, manage the infrastructure for me. I want to kind of be more higher level. And so those are choices that you get to make. And we offer options in all these places across the entire spectrum. So, on one end, we have virtual machines where this lets you, this is more along the lines of where you can go create a VM, you get to manage it yourself, you get kind of complete control. And so this is more kind of on the sysadmin side. Kind of on the other side of that spectrum is where you might decide to go all in on containers, in which case we offer you the ability, for example, let's say to run something like Kubernetes in our container service, and so you can be kind of completely developer oriented in that sense, and just be focusing on building your containers, and you can deploy them onto our infrastructure, and we'll run those containers for you. And then kind of moving up to the higher level, where if you want more managed infrastructure, well, we have services like app service, where we will, again, you can kind of create, let's say, a website, and this might be an ASP.NET website, or it might be a PHP website, or it could be a Node.js website, or a REST API, and we will kind of wrap and do all of the, provide all the reverse proxy that you need, all of the TLS termination, kind of all of that, and manage that infrastructure completely for you. And so you don't need to kind of worry about all of that. Batch, there's another example where you might have batch workloads that, we can kind of run and manage that infrastructure for you, and you don't need to kind of worry about that. So those are different choices that you get to make. It's all around how much control you want versus how much of the management headache you want to get rid of. So it's really, we have options. It's kind of a menu, and you get to decide there. So, and even with all of these, there's all sorts of choices here, in terms of technology and OS and environment. So, for example, obviously we support Windows, we support Linux as well. You get to decide whether you want to run .NET or Java or Python or Go or Node. You get to kind of decide that. Same thing with on the container side. You get to decide, do you want to run Swarm, Mesos, Kubernetes? We're open. Kind of going right back to the theme of, we want to go run the world's workloads. You want to make those choices. We want to enable you to make those choices, and then we'll run them. I think this just kind of gets a little bit more into the detail of, different decisions that you might want to go and make. So, if you're running kind of, 1Z, 2Z VMs, you might pick individual machines. If you want to create a whole bunch of machines that are all identical and kind of manage them in an identical way, that's more the scale set side. If you want to go the microservice approach, that's kind of more on, whether you're using container service, and then service fabric is more of, allowing you to go do more of a managed microservice approach. And that's kind of where things like, Marathon, OpenShift, and so on come in as well. And then, kind of lastly, we obviously couldn't do this without our partners, and we have a full depth of partners, across the board, small companies, large companies, startups, enterprises, you name it. And This is across on the OS side, this is across on the container side, DevOps on the data front, you name it. We have partnerships and joint agreements with all these different companies to help run these workloads on Azure. That's kind of about all I had on the formal presentation front. And then the rest of it, I was planning to just walk through a demo, and then kind of maybe just go through the actual portal experience itself. Before I start doing that, were there any questions that I could answer?
Feel free to use the chat window, and I will unmute whoever needs to chime in. If not, I guess we can continue with the demo. I'm looking forward to that.
Okay, sounds great. All right. So let me start with maybe one thing here. I'm just going to start off with some options in terms of running VMs. This is more on the, let's say you pick that you decide you want to run VMs. What are some choices that you have? So we have, first off, a few different categories of virtual machines. So you get to kind of pick, what kind of workload you want to go and run. So there's kind of just the general purpose stuff, which is, it's balanced in terms of CPU and memory. There's compute optimized. So this is lots of CPU, maybe a little bit lower in terms of memory. This is memory optimized, which is extremely high amounts of RAM. There's obviously also storage optimized, so if you're running databases, and then a few specialty ones. So these are if you're doing a lot of GPU compute, or if you're doing a lot of HPC compute, type workloads as well. And so those are different categories that we have, and then we're constantly continuing to add more categories as well. And then we have, obviously we have a bunch of different options in terms of Linux, Windows, etc. So let me just kind of talk about, for instance, if you picked CentOS or Ubuntu, and you wanted to, let's say, go with a general purpose, and let's say you want to pick, the A size, the A series, which is some of the basic options. This is roughly telling you, approximately what the pricing is going to be for these things here. So, A series is approximately $11.91 a month, and then there's obviously different options over here as well. This kind of gets you into the full-blown set of things that you could go and look at. Let's kind of go back here. If you picked something other than CentOS or Ubuntu, so this might be a situation where there are obviously certain enterprises are very picky on only running Red Hat, and so for those kind of places, so for instance, if you're a startup who's selling into enterprises, we support Red Hat as well, and Red Hat obviously has a license cost too, and so there's not only the cost for the infrastructure, but then there's also the cost for the Red Hat software as well, and these kind of prices are listed here too. All of this is just on the website itself. You're more than welcome to go and look at this directly. There's nothing. This is not anything private in here, and I can send out the links to these things subsequent to my talk. So kind of let's get past that, and then let's get into the actual portal experience itself. So this is the Azure portal. So if you go to portal.azure.com, that takes you over here. You'll probably see an experience that is similar to this. Here on the left-hand side, where my mouse is, this is where all of the resources that you may have created will start to show up. And in this particular case, I'm on a specific subscription that I'm using for demo purposes, which is why there's really nothing else in here. And so let me just maybe start with creating a new VM. Oh, one thing before I start with this whole experience, I'm going to show you a set of things from the portal here today, everything that I can do from the portal, number one, you can do obviously from any browser on any kind of platform. So if you're using MacBooks, obviously this is going to work fine there. But also, if you want to go in and automate this using APIs, we have APIs to do every single one of these things in a variety of different programming languages. Also, if you want to kind of do this or automate this more from a shell script point of view, we have options to go use this from. We have a CLI tool written in Python that you can use from your shell of choice on a Mac or Linux, or we have PowerShell commandlets as well if you're using Windows. So as I said, let's start with just creating a new VM. Let's say that we want to create a new Ubuntu VM, and I'm going to pick, let's say, Ubuntu 14.04, which at this point, I have a number of options in here. So yeah, let's pick this one, and we're going to go create the VM here. Normally, the way that this starts out is there's a few settings that I get to configure. So I get to give the VM name. So let's just maybe call it test VM or something like that. I can pick the type that I want, whether I want SSD disks or whether I want HDD disks. Let's just stick with that default. I'll give this is the username that I want to go and create inside the VM. So this is the user that'll be provisioned. So let's give my name. I can either give a password or an SSH public key. So let's stick with the key. So this happens to be a public key that I just happen to have copied. That's my key there. So I can kind of give that. Here's the subscription, and then here's the resource group name that I mentioned here. So let's just say that this is let's give it a test VM name. And here's the location is where I get to provide the region. And so let's just stick with West US 2 as the default here. So those are some of the basic settings. Once I've went through that, now here's where I get to pick the size, and let's pick the DS1 V2. So this is a 1-core, 3.5 gigabytes. Obviously, I can go look at other options if I want to do. So if I did that, I'll see the full set of options that I could go and look at here as well. So let's select this, and then there are optional features that I can supply if I want to. For instance, if I wanted to change my network configuration, if I wanted to turn on firewalls, if I wanted to create VM extensions, if I wanted to do things around my diagnostics, all of these things. There's also, if I wanted to turn on my availability, if I wanted to have high availability and so on. So those are all different options in here that I can go and configure. I'll leave those for now as the default values. And then the deployment is submitted, and now it's going to you can kind of see this out here on the screen where it's starting to go and deploy it, and this will go on for a few minutes. While this is going on, I can kind of talk about some of the other various things that you can actually go and deploy here as well. So, for instance, if you look at all the things that are out there in the marketplace, there's a variety of different aspects. There's we have things, as I said, in general compute. There's also various things that we have on the networking side, where you can go create virtual networks. You can create public IP addresses and things of that nature. There's on the storage side, you can create kind of storage accounts, which are effectively the ways that you can go create blobs and disks of that nature. There's also here's where you can create manage SQL instances and things of that aspect. Web and mobile is where if you want to go create web apps, you can this is the way that you can create things to let's say host your web app here, and again it can be in the language of or platform or framework of your choice. Similarly, if you want to go create mobile apps that are the mobile backends for let's say iOS or Android apps, you can do the same thing here too. There's also we have media services. We have if you wanted to run search. So if you had, let's say, kind of some sort of let's say a front end, like a catalog for a store of some sorts. We have a service that can provide you search, across that site automatically. So these are all different options in here. So it looks like my deployment succeeded. So let's go back to the home, and so here was the VM that I had submitted, and so there you go. So now you can see that this is running, and this is roughly kind of what the CPU average is. It looks like, and this will get up to date as it starts to get more data. So because I think this is just in the last hour, and so as it starts to build information up, this will start to show up in there. If I wanted to go and connect, there's information in here that tells me exactly how I would connect. And so, I could just open up my SSH client and give that IP address, assuming that I had my private key, for the public key that I had specified before, and now I will be able to go in there and connect up to the VM there directly. So that's just a quick example of getting going with the Linux VM. Let's go back to the marketplace, and so if I go to create a new, let's go through a different example here. Let's say that if instead of just creating a single VM, what I wanted to go create was a collection of VMs. So this is what we call a virtual machine scale set. So in terms of what a scale set is exactly what I just did with a single VM, but just replicating that, where instead of saying I just want one VM, I could say, well, I want, let's say, 10 VMs. And so I won't go through the full example of creation of this, but I kind of should walk you through what's possible. So, again, you kind of go through the whole create flow. All the basic settings are pretty similar. So let's say that it's Linux again. Let's say that I want to give my username, again, that. I want to supply my same public key. Cannot take hyphens in here. So, and then, I want to give it a resource group. So I can give it a new name here. Let's stick with the same region. And here's where I get to supply some of you notice that some of these settings are a little bit different from the previous one. So here's where, for instance, I can give it what FQDM I want. So maybe this is, just say something of this nature. Let's just say to give it a test name or something. Here's where I get to supply what operating system I want. And so, earlier I had said Linux. So these are some of the default options that are available for VM scale sets here. So I could pick CentOS, I could pick CoreOS. We have Debian variants. There's some SUSE variants. There's Red Hat, of course, and then there's Ubuntu. So let's say I'll go pick the latest CentOS. Here's where I get to supply how many instances I want. So I can pick between 1 and 100. On the previous screen, we do have support for going all the way up to 1,000 as well. And so that's obviously a very, very large deployment. If you have an extremely high-scale service, you could go and deploy into something of that nature. So in this case, I'm just going to go pick a number like 10, and I can, and then I can enable, if I want, automatically scaling based on CPU usage. So if I enable this, here's where I get to configure the defaults on how autoscale itself is configured. So this might be the minimum. Maybe let's say the minimum I want is 2. Maybe the maximum I want is 10. And then if the average CPU percentage goes to 75% or more, that's when I want to start to scale up. And then and maybe this is how many VMs I want to increase at a time. So each time, maybe I'm only adding 1 VM at a time. And then scale in is where this is the threshold at which I want to start to reduce VMs. So let's say maybe the average CPU goes below 25%, then I want to start to go delete VMs automatically. So, and then this is the number of VMs to go start deleting at a time. And so here's where, I can configure these things out here. And, as you can see, in the first example, that was, you had complete control. You could do whatever you wanted to. If you wanted to go create 10 VMs that way, you could do that, and you could control it entirely. In this case here, if you want to allow the platform manage, more aspects of the scaling characteristics, well, here's a, VM scale sets, is a solution for that. And so, if I submit this deployment, which let me go ahead and do that anyway, and so this will start to go there and deploy that scale set there. Any questions so far? Great. So then let me start to maybe talk through some of the other kinds of. Oh, is there a question? I think perhaps.
Yes, Gustavo, I'm going to unmute you right now if I know how to. There you go. Go for it. Gustavo, all yours. If you want to put it in a chat window, we're happy to take that too.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, there we go. So the question that I have is that better?
Yep, we can hear you.
Oh, so the question that I have is related to versions of operating system. For instance, for a client that is deploying, let's say, 10 of those virtual servers on CentOS, and there's a major patch that needs to go in, and let's say that the customer chooses so that teams at Azure actually update those of the operating system. How do you go about that? Is there a major dramatic change there on cost and work or elaborate work to upgrade different versions of OS?
Good question. It's a good question. So I think there's I think you have two choices as far as how you want to think about that, about that infrastructure. One choice is that, so one option is you could say that you don't really patch, and that what you do instead is that you will just treat all of this infrastructure that you create as immutable. So you would not ever modify this. And so then if you decide that there's a new patch that you want to go in there and roll out, you would just stand up new infrastructure, transition your traffic over to that new one, and then delete the old ones. So that's one way to do it. And if you do that, when every time that there's a new let's say update like this, we work with our publishers, our image publishers, to publish new versions of the image, and we always have a latest tag. And so you could, let's say, index off that latest tag and use that to deploy your images. So that's one way. Another way is to say, okay, you're going to actually go create these VMs, and then they're going to be long-lived, and so then you're going to go and patch them. In those cases, we've partnered with every one of these publishers, so that there are the package repositories that the publishers all maintain. They reside inside each Azure region to provide good latency, and so then each OS has its own way of configuring patch downloads, And so you could configure, for instance, auto update, or you could configure like a cron job to periodically go and check for patches and download those security updates automatically, and then go and install them. And so that's kind of one common way that people go and do this. We also have other options. We have a different offering called OMS, which is Operations Management Suite, that's more targeted at enterprise customers, that allows them to give you more direct control on the patching. So you get to, like, if you wanted to, for instance, decide and orchestrate patching yourself, to be able to go and say, okay, patch this server now. Once that patching is done, then go and patch this next server. So we have a few different choices there. Did that answer the question?
Yes, it did. It did. Thank you so much.
Great. Any other questions? Otherwise, then I'll start with looking at some of the other kinds of workloads, maybe looking at some of the data-oriented ones that are out there. Okay, let me switch gears a little bit, looking at some of the data-oriented ones. So I'm not sure what kind of tech stacks most of you guys are using right now. One very common thing that I find as I talk to startups is that many of them use what's called the ELK stack. So this is Elastic, and let me refresh this thing out here. I think I'm on a beta version of the portal, and so sometimes this thing needs to get refreshed out here. So as I was saying, so many startups that I know use what's called the ELK stack, where so this is Elastic, Logstash, Kibana, and this is the VM scale set that has been created successfully. That's what it's telling me here. So we've done work with Elastic to bring this entire stack on Azure, and so this is something that you can also easily go and create, as I said, using the portal as well as using all of the APIs. So if I pick this, I can just kind of go through some of the options that are available. I can, again, here's the username that I want to provide. In this case, maybe here's my public key again. Let's give another resource group. Let's say test RG Elastic is the name. Let's go through some of this. And then now I'm getting into supplying some details about Elastic itself. So I get to supply the Elastic version. So there's a variety of different versions out there. As you can see, let's pick the latest one. Let's give it a cluster name. So let's say test Elastic, and then I get to configure the subnets. Let's just pick the default versions out here. And then once I've done that, now I get to move on to configuring more of the more the sizes of the clusters themselves. So let's say so this is all of the nodes will be prefixed with this name. This tells me how many data nodes I want. So I can start with as low as 1. I think the Elastic typically recommends 3 as the minimum. I could go as large as 50 if I wanted to have a very, very large Elastic cluster. Let's just stick with 3. Here's where I get to supply the size of the data nodes. I'll stick with the default for now. This one is where I get to decide if I want the data nodes to be mass eligible as well. For doing leader election and so on. And then let's just say if I say pick yes, and then here's where if I want your client nodes for use of the jump box or something of that nature, and let's just leave that as 0. And then I guess it has to only be 5 characters, so let's go with that. And so once I've done that, there's more configuration, I can supply, and this is where I'm supplying, Elastic specific, users and whatnot. Once I configure these things, then, let's just go with test for everything. So I'm just supplying, test users for everything in here. Obviously, this is not secure. So if you were doing this for real, you would give properly secured credentials at this point. And lastly, here's where I want to say, do I want Kibana? If I do, I can just say I don't. Do I want a jump box? Do I want a load balancer? And then once I provide all of this, if I go through here, then it'll actually start to provision an Elastic cluster itself. So here's an example of Elastic. We also have, so let's just discard this for now. Let's go back to another example. Let's go to actually, I'll pick Mongo, because that's another common example that we find with startups. So if I go with Mongo, here are my options here again. So with Mongo, we have actually two options. You could either just run Mongo yourself in a VM, that's this first one, or Microsoft can actually provide Mongo as a service, as a kind of a database as a service. So this is more of a managed experience with that, and so that's an option as well. And so the service specifically that we can do this with is we have a service called DocDB, which you can use and is compatible with the entire MongoDB API. And so we provide a 4.9 SLA on the service, and you can use your favorite MongoDB API, MongoDB drivers, and just completely take care of that. So in this case here, we completely manage the database infrastructure for you, including all of the failover, the reliability, and the management of that. So this is an option, if you're using a kind of a Mongo stack. You can of course go in there and run your own Mongo cluster as well, on VMs, and that's an option too. And then we have other options. Let's pick another common one that I see with a lot of startups is Cassandra, and so let's go back here. So Cassandra is another NoSQL store that people can go and run. We have a few options there as well. We have a kind of a vanilla version of Cassandra. That's the Apache distribution that's available. We also have the full-blown enterprise version of Cassandra that's published by DataStax, and so that's kind of another option as well. So if you pick that, this kind of gives you a full-blown example of what that would look like. So I won't walk through all of this right now in the interest of time, because we're almost done. I wanted to open the floor up for other questions.
On the MongoDB, what versions are available now, or what are the suggested versions that you guys are offering? Because I know that there were some security issues with the version 2.6, and so have you moved just about everything to be on 3 and above, or the latest?
So I think some of the older versions, some of the older images are still around, but we do have the latest images as well. Yes, and then as far as as our managed offering, we do support those kind of the newer versions of the APIs and so on too, but that's more at an API level compatibility.
And then on the questions of DocDB, you mentioned that there is the version where you guys do a lot of the data architecture itself. Is that how I understood it?
Correct.
In that version, then the data that some of the startups are getting and how we're crawling it and so on. That's still all ownership of the startup company, right? That doesn't
Correct.
really, okay. And
Correct. The data is still owned by you. It's just that we are managing the infrastructure that runs the database itself.
Okay. And then I noticed that you mentioned using the favorite drivers to access the database. Is there suggestions of the most common best practices and best drivers used, or suggestions on that end from the .db?
Yes. So there's actually a lot of content on our website that talks about solution kits and starter kits and so on. And I can send a link out to some of those things. And a bunch of those suggestions are covered in that.
And then lastly, connected to this, any preference on the language? Especially going into the machine learning, is Python then the supported language for the DocDB? And
absolutely, we have APIs for both Python and Node, and of course a bunch of other languages too. Those are the two common ones. But Python is definitely a tier 1 language with a lot of support.
And then go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. I was going to say, because you mentioned ML, I didn't have a chance to talk about ML as well, but we have a large number of machine learning-based services available as well. And perhaps this might be a topic for a good deep dive next time around, Steve.
Yeah, we have that on the schedule on the machine learning. Another Tech.Talk.
That's very important for us.
Oh yeah, it's AI and ML has been a hot requested topic, so we're going to definitely do that.
And then lastly, in today's, MongoDB is fairly new, and so maybe I'm looking at the wrong areas, but I've been having a hard time finding more business intelligence applications for it. Is there one already enabled with Azure services?
What do you mean by BI apps on MongoDB?
So we currently have quite a bit of data, and so it would be great not to have to go to full development on Python to or even use the query language on MongoDB, but maybe a user graphic interface of a BI to kind of do what Tableau software does for SQL or Metabase does for SQL. Is there a BI version for MongoDB on Azure, or even from?
I see. I'm actually not sure about that. I can certainly go do a little bit of homework and follow up on that one. Are you using Mongo today, or is this?
We are.
Okay.
And we currently have.
Got it.
20 million records accumulated. So that's why I'm kind of going to utilizing some of these tools, because we kind of have to start calculating costs, and the only way to calculate cost per user is to really run certain queries, do some logs, and find out how much per user, particular widget of information that is passed from user to client, from server to client, and calculate the load. To figure those things, which is kind of also another question on how to calculate the cost long term.
Right. So we have a calculator. We have a pricing calculator on the website. I can send a link to that as well. Regarding your, I think I understand the kind of the question on the BI tool on Mongo. I'm not familiar with one myself, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So I can take a follow-up to figure that out. Is there one that you are using today?
No, but not one. I mean, I'm getting closer to looking into Metabase, which is open source, but there isn't, because I haven't been able to find anything. I know that there was a BI that it's on the enterprise of MongoDB, but I think that's more on the server administration side rather than a BI for the data itself, and that's where I'm having a hard time finding a tool that can be helpful for that.
Got it. Yep.
Gustavo, I can follow up with you. Maybe Power BI is a good exploration, but let's talk after this.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll help you explore choices. So I think we are out of time, but Anand, thank you so much. This was a very, very informative talk and a great overview. And feel free to send more questions to me, and I'll route them to Anand after this recording. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.